April 1945. Liberation should have meant joy, yet in the Dutch lowlands, children still died quietly in their mothers' arms. Typhus, the camp disease, had crossed front lines faster than tanks. When the first American trucks rumbled into Utrecht, the locals expected soldiers. Instead, outstepped men and women in khaki armbands marked with a red and blue caduceus. They carried steel cases packed with glass vials and a smell of disinfectant that cut through the stench of starvation. Inside a commandeered schoolhouse, benches became hospital cots. A field stove hissed. A nurse boiled needles until steam fogged the windows. Mothers watched, frozen between fear and disbelief, as the strangers called their children forward, one by one. Each injection was a promise that the war's invisible killer would end here. When the first little girl blinked back tears and lived through the night without fever, a crowd outside began to sob. They had seen tanks before, but never mercy wearing an American uniform. By dusk, soldiers were carting empty vaccine bottles to the street. The townspeople whispered the count, hundreds already, soon thousands. Word traveled down every canal and across the ruined bridges. The Americans are vaccinating our children. Some swore angels had arrived. Others simply fell to their knees in exhaustion and relief. No headlines marked the moment. There was no flag raised, no victory speech, only the soft click of syringes and the tremor of hands that had buried too many. Yet for the Dutch, that quiet day would be remembered longer than any battle, because it proved something unimaginable. America's weapon was compassion, and it could conquer even death. For 5 years, the Netherlands had been an occupied laboratory of cruelty disguised as order. The German administration boasted of efficiency, ration cards, curfews, sterilized clinics, but behind the statistics lay rot. Hospitals were stripped for the Reich, vaccines rerouted to German troops, doctors ordered to report only manageable outbreaks. By 1944, the enemy's confidence bordered on arrogance. They believed disease would do their work, hunger, lice, and cold finishing what bombs began. In their offices, German medical officers wrote reports claiming typhus under control. In the cellars of Amsterdam, Dutch nurses treated children wrapped in rags, counting fevers by candlelight. Every month mortality climbed. The occupiers dismissed it as natural attrition. They were so certain of their dominance that they burned epidemiological records before retreating, proof erased, as if suffering could be deleted from memory. Even as Allied bombers darkened the skies, the Wehrmacht believed they still ruled by fear. "No enemy will reach Holland before winter kills half its people," one officer sneered, his words caught in a civilian diary later recovered from Rotterdam. And yet, as the front collapsed, German medics themselves fell ill. The same lice that had swarmed Dutch children now crawled beneath their uniforms. Their laboratories lacked glass, their hospitals ether, their pharmacies hope. Still, they believed the Americans would be too busy with victory parades to bother with the dying Dutch. They were wrong. By the time German command fled the northern provinces, their health network was gone, doctors scattered, sanitation destroyed, vaccine reserves stolen or spoiled. Villages like Breda, Tilburg and Utrecht became islands of contagion. Yet in the ruins whispers grew. The Allies have doctors. The Americans bring medicine. The occupiers dismissed it as rumor, but those rumors carried truth across borders faster than any army. The Reich had conquered by fear. Now fear itself was crumbling, because somewhere beyond the front, a new kind of invasion was forming, one armed not with rifles, but with syringes. When the first American medics crossed into liberated Holland, they found no front line, only famine. Fields lay frozen, railways shattered, hospitals stripped to concrete shells. The Germans had left behind the kind of devastation no bullet could fix. Sewage overflow, dead livestock, water pumps frozen with disease. The First Army's medical convoys carried fewer trucks than a single infantry regiment, yet their orders were absurdly vast. Restore sanitation, control epidemics, and feed the weak before hunger finished them. Most supplies were already spent on France and Belgium. Vaccine crates arrived half empty, delayed by washed-out bridges and shell-torn roads. The field diaries of American medics read like pleas: need soap before serum, need light before surgery. Yet they refused to turn back. These were soldiers who had carried morphine through artillery fire and dragged plasma units over the Rhine. Compared to that, disease was just another battlefield. Even Allied commanders doubted them. British civil affairs officers warned the Americans that vaccination on this scale was logistically impossible. Some Dutch administrators, still starving themselves, didn't believe help would come at all. But the Americans had learned something through war. The impossible was only logistics waiting for courage. They scrounged gasoline from wrecked vehicles, used mess tent stoves as sterilizers, and mapped distribution routes by flashlight. At night, they slept in abandoned schools beside Dutch nurses who hadn't seen antibiotics in years. When locals offered them their last potatoes, the medics traded cigarettes instead. "Save your food," one lieutenant said. "You'll need strength for tomorrow." The odds were hopeless. Too few men, too little vaccine, too many mouths. But for once in Europe, American strategy wasn't about tanks or air power. It was about mercy turned into logistics. Behind every syringe lay the same stubborn conviction that had carried them across the Atlantic. If it could be done, Americans would do it. Long before Dutch liberation, the Americans had seen this coming. Months earlier, while battles still raged in the Ardennes, a quiet directive circulated through the Surgeon General's office in Washington. It wasn't stamped top secret, just urgent. The enemy's retreat, it warned, would leave a trail of disease across Europe. Typhus, dysentery, smallpox, silent weapons no treaty could disarm. The Americans decided to fight them with something the Reich had never mastered: organized compassion. The plan took shape under fluorescent lights at the Army Medical Center. They called it Typhus Control Program Number 17, a blueprint for an invasion of microbes instead of men. Industrial chemists, engineers, and epidemiologists became soldiers of a new front. Pfizer's Brooklyn plant, once a penicillin fortress, converted part of its line to mass-produce the Cox-type vaccine. Millions of glass ampules labeled U.S. Army Medical Department. Each one would be flown or shipped into liberated zones like bullets of mercy. In England, refrigeration experts designed field boxes that could keep vaccine cold for 72 hours without power. Logistics officers tested distribution under blackout conditions, calculating doses not by rank or nationality, but by risk. Engineers built mobile delousing trucks fitted with DDT sprayers, while Red Cross volunteers translated medical leaflets into Dutch and French. Every detail mattered: sterilization temperatures, injection intervals, even the thickness of the glass vials to prevent breakage in transit. But the strategy wasn't just medical, it was psychological. Planners understood that Europe, starved and frightened, needed to see mercy in uniform. "The sight of an American soldier vaccinating a child," one memo read, "will heal wounds that medicine alone cannot." They weren't exaggerating. Every dose would serve as both cure and symbol, proof that America's power didn't end at victory. It extended to restoration. By the time the first trucks rolled north from Antwerp in April 1945, the system was ready. Crates were stamped with serial codes, temperature logs attached, manifests double-signed. Behind the paper trail was a doctrine as radical as it was simple: war could end through health. While Europe's armies demobilized, America's medics prepared for their most humane campaign yet, the invasion of disease. And when those convoys crossed into the Netherlands, no one outside a handful of officers knew the scale of what was about to begin. By mid-April 1945, the front had gone strangely quiet. German resistance flickered out across the southern Netherlands, leaving behind bridges twisted like bones and roads cratered with shell holes. Into that silence rolled a different kind of convoy, olive-green trucks marked Medical Department, U.S. Army. Inside, crates of glass vials clinked together like fragile hope. Soldiers joked that they were hauling ammunition for angels. Each town was a new problem. roads flooded by spring melt-trapped vehicles for hours. Gasoline was rationed tighter than bread. Yet according to Dutch municipal logs, every convoy arrived within hours of its target time. American engineers rebuilt crossings overnight, using tank planks as makeshift bridges so vaccine trucks could reach inland provinces. At Eindhoven, the campaign's command post, local technicians rewired the ruined Philips factory to power sterilizers and refrigeration units. The electricity pulsed on at midnight, lighting a city that hadn't glowed since occupation. Dutch nurses, some still in wooden shoes, reported for duty at dawn. Their first assignment: convert schools and churches into immunization centers. Blackboards became notice boards for dosage schedules. Pews turned into waiting benches. Military precision met village improvisation. Each site had a chart. Hour 0, children under 10. Hour 1, ages 11 to 16. Field medics rotated in 12-hour shifts. Every bottle emptied was logged by hand and tagged with the words, "Expended in liberation use." Despite exhaustion, morale climbed. The air itself changed, the smell of antiseptic replacing decay. For the first time since the war began, the Dutch heard the sound of generators running not for factories of war, but for clinics of peace. Across the border, German intelligence dismissed reports of American medical convoys as nonsense propaganda. But in the candlelit homes of Breda and Tilburg, parents whispered that the Americans had brought life in trucks instead of death. And when the first shipments reached Utrecht, one nurse wrote simply in her diary, "Tomorrow, we begin." April 25, 1945. Dawn broke grey over Utrecht, the kind of thin northern light that made the ruins glow like ash. Outside a converted schoolhouse, mothers lined up in silence, children pressed against their skirts. A wind carried the smell of carbolic soap and boiled water, the scent of something between fear and rebirth. American trucks idled nearby, engines humming like a promise. From their canvas flaps, medics unloaded metal cases and lanterns. Each crate was stenciled in block letters. WWII inside, desks were pushed aside. Tables covered with sterilized sheets filled the room. A pot-bellied stove hissed in one corner, keeping the vaccine from freezing. A nurse named Ruth Sullivan adjusted her armband, its red and blue caduceus catching the lamplight. She glanced toward a Dutch translator and nodded. "We're ready," she said. The first child, a boy no older than 6, stepped forward. His cheeks were hollow, his hair shaved short against lice. He didn't cry. The syringe pierced, withdrew, and left only a faint white mark. His mother exhaled for the first time in days. Then another child came, and another. Soon the line stretched down the corridor and out the door into the street. A local priest, his cassock patched at the elbows, blessed each vial before it was unsealed. Outside, a soldier handed out biscuits from a field ration tin. For many, it was their first solid food in weeks. The crowd grew until the town square filled with murmurs and sobs. "They said the war was over," one woman whispered, "but now I believe it." By afternoon, the medics had immunized 2,000 children. The sound inside the gym was steady, needles tapping glass, stoves hissing, quiet weeping. Ruth wrote in her notebook, "No resistance, only gratitude." At dusk, she and her team packed the empty ampules into a wooden box labeled "Expended." Soldiers carried them outside like trophies. Over the next 48 hours, convoys spread north and west. Amersfoort, Haarlem, Leiden, each town receiving its own miracle of glass and steel. Dutch newspapers, printed on scraps of recycled paper, called it the Army of Life. And when infection reports began to fall, 1 week, then 2, the truth settled in. For the first time since 1940, children went to bed without fever. In the ruins of occupation, America had staged a different kind of invasion, one that healed instead of conquered. The guns had gone silent, but under the soft click of syringes, a new sound rose in the Netherlands, the heartbeat of a country coming back to life. When news of the vaccination convoys reached the retreating German garrisons, it spread faster than any radio broadcast. Field officers who had once sneered at American sentimentalism, now read interrogation transcripts describing lines of Dutch civilians weeping as enemy soldiers saved their children. The irony bit deep. In makeshift camps across Germany, captured Wehrmacht doctors whispered the same phrase. They inoculate our enemies' children while our own die of fever. The reversal was total. For years the Reich had weaponized despair, convinced that starvation and disease would break occupied peoples faster than bullets. But the Americans had flipped the equation. Compassion, not cruelty, ruled the post-war field. The shock wasn't only military, it was moral. Dutch civilians began to see the change almost overnight. The same uniforms that once thundered past in tanks now appeared in hospital wards. Soldiers carried disinfectant instead of rifles, speaking softly in broken Dutch as they lifted children onto cots. Entire towns gathered at road junctions to wave, not flags but handkerchiefs. An old woman in Breda pressed her hands to her face and whispered, "They came to kill Germans, and they are saving us instead." Even German prisoners, assigned to assist in cleanup, stood in stunned silence. Under guard, they shoveled out old barracks, spraying DDT under direction of American sergeants. When one medic asked if he might receive the vaccine himself, an American lieutenant paused, then nodded. "We don't choose who gets sick," he said. The prisoner bowed his head and held out his arm. Rumors of that moment raced through the POW ranks, eroding what little pride remained. What propaganda could survive a truth so visible? The Americans had conquered without a shot. In the ruins of Europe, victory had taken on a new shape. It wore a white armband, carried a needle, and treated the defeated with the same steady hands that once carried the wounded from battlefields. The Reich's ideology had collapsed long before its armies did. This was the proof. By summer 1945, the transformation was visible in numbers as well as faces. The Dutch Ministry of Health, newly reconstituted under Allied supervision, recorded a collapse in typhus infections, from hundreds of weekly cases to almost none by June. Hospitals that had once overflowed with fever wards now stood half empty. The Dutch Red Cross called it the quietest victory of the war. For the Americans, the campaign became a logistical marvel. Field officers who had survived Anzio and Normandy now spoke of Utrecht and Breda as their proudest operations. "No battle lasted so long or saved so many," wrote one medic in his after-action summary. The figures were staggering. Over 100,000 children vaccinated, tens of thousands deloused, hundreds of villages cleared of contagion. In the eyes of Dutch citizens, it was not only medicine, it was resurrection. The political effect was immediate. Where occupation had sown hatred and suspicion, the medical convoys planted trust. Mayors sent handwritten letters of gratitude to US commanders. Churches rang their bells for the first time in years. Dutch newspapers printed photographs of smiling nurses beneath headlines that read, "The healers from across the sea." International observers noticed too. British and Canadian officers requested copies of the American procedures, while representatives from the newly formed United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration arrived to study the operation. Within months, its methods, mobile refrigeration, rapid record systems and delousing protocols, were adopted across liberated Europe. Even German prisoners assisting the campaign found their duties changing. The act of serving life instead of death broke something inside them that propaganda never could. Many later testified that it was the first time they believed the war was truly over. When General Eisenhower visited Holland that autumn, he stopped briefly at a converted school clinic. Watching an American nurse bandage a child's arm, he turned to his aide and said quietly, "This is what victory should look like." And for the Netherlands, it did. In the decades that followed, historians would struggle to categorize what happened in the Netherlands in the spring of 1945. It wasn't a battle, yet it carried the discipline of one. It wasn't diplomacy, yet it changed hearts faster than treaties. The vaccination campaign became a blueprint for post-war humanity, a quiet revolution fought with vials instead of guns. Within 3 years, its influence had spread across continents. American military medical manuals began citing the Dutch operation as a case study in civic action, noting that logistics once reserved for ammunition now carried antibiotics, plasma, and vaccine. When the World Health Organization drafted its founding charter in 1948, observers from the Netherlands pointed to the Allied typhus and diphtheria programs as living proof that global health could rise from wartime ruins. In Dutch schools, children who had once stood trembling in those long lines grew up to teach medicine, nursing, and public health. They remembered the day the Americans came not as foreign occupation, but as deliverance. By the early 1950s, a small bronze statue appeared in Utrecht's Beatrixplein, a nurse bending over a child, her sleeve bearing an American insignia. It bore no inscription, only a single word: dankbaar, grateful. For the U.S. Army Medical Corps, the operation became moral doctrine. Training films used real footage from those Dutch clinics to teach young medics that mercy was strategy's most enduring weapon. "You fight disease the same way you fight tyranny," said one instructor, "with courage, coordination, and belief in life." Academics later noted another legacy. The campaign restored faith in science to a continent that had watched medicine twisted by ideology. German doctors had experimented on prisoners. American doctors had vaccinated the enemy's children. The contrast redefined what it meant to serve humanity under arms. By the 1960s, Dutch archives listed the vaccination drive among the nation's miracles of reconstruction. And yet, those who had been there remembered something simpler: the look on a mother's face when fever broke, the silence of a town that realized its children would live. Wars are measured by what they destroy, this one by what it healed. In the Netherlands, liberation did not end with surrender. It ended with a needle, a tear, and a promise that mercy could be mightier than war itself. When the last ampule was emptied and the final record signed, the American medical teams packed their gear in silence. There were no parades waiting, no headlines shouting their names, only the echo of children's laughter drifting through schoolyards that had once been morgues. In the eyes of those medics, victory had taken on a different shape. It wasn't a flag or a medal. It was a steady pulse under a small wrist that might not have survived the winter. Back home, most Americans never heard of the Dutch vaccination campaign. The soldiers and nurses returned to their towns, blending into the post-war crowds, carrying memories too quiet for speeches. Yet their work left something indelible behind, a legacy of service that turned conquest into compassion. The Netherlands recovered not only its freedom, but its faith in humanity, stitched together by the steady hands of strangers. In the decades since, historians have written volumes about Europe's reconstruction, about bridges rebuilt, borders redrawn, nations reborn. But the truest reconstruction began in those makeshift clinics, where mercy was practiced like discipline and kindness became logistics. For every child who lived, a world healed a little more. Today, when the world again trembles before unseen enemies, disease, disaster, division, the lesson of 1945 still speaks clearly. Strength is not proven by domination, but by restoration. The measure of power is not how many enemies are defeated, but how many lives are defended. So when history asks what defined America at its best, the answer will not come from a battlefield. It will come from a quiet Dutch schoolhouse where the guns had gone silent, and an American nurse lifted a child's arm to the light and said softly, "You're safe now," because in that moment mercy itself wore the uniform of victory,